Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And that's a wide umbrella that I cast because I like to bring in lots of different topics. I like to bring in lots of different subjects and to be able to broaden our view of the world through those various modalities. But astrology is my main focus, and that's where I usually put all my effort into it. Before we get my guest on, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which comes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find a couple of paragraphs of mundane astrology that apply to the whole planet and where we are in the world today as we swirl in this gigantic ball of ours through the universe. And then I break it out into the individual signs below. I always encourage you to read your sun sign and your rising sign to get more accuracy for the week to come. And, of course, if you have any questions, obviously contact me. So, without any further ado, I want to get my guest on. My guest today is Grasse. He's a wonderful astrologer, author, and actually a pianist and a wonderful photographer as well. So he wears quite a few hats, and he wears them all very well, I might add. I've had him on several times in the past to talk about his works. He has a new book out now, just about to be released, called An Infinity of Gods. It's the teachings of Shelly Trimmer, and he's on with us today, Ray. So great to have you on to the show today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So I was very intrigued. I saw you post on Facebook about you're working with this fellow and going through your notes and sort of reviving these long-lost archives that you had of information. And I'm curious how you came to know Shelly Trimmer and how you came to sort of forge this connection with him.
It all started with a teacher in Chicago by the name of Goswami Kriyananda, who's not to be confused with Swami Kriyananda of California, though they're both of the same lineage. And I was studying with Goswami Kriyananda. I started when I was about 19, and he spoke about this teacher of his that lived down in Florida, who was a very mysterious figure that was a great occultist, mystic, astrologer, magician. And the more stories I heard about this man, the more I was determined to try and meet him anyway. And so I sent him several requests. And then, in fact, it's amazing. 40 years ago tomorrow is the first meeting I had with him. It's a long time ago.
Perfect time to revive this information.
Well, that is interesting. I'm considering this is the first interview I'm doing for the book, actually, so the timing is quite uncanny. And we're coming up actually to his 40th birthday. I mean, his 100th anniversary of his birth, because he was born in late October of 2017. He died in 1996. But so I went down September 15th of 1977 to meet him at his home. His wife had just died, and he was there with his dog. And I spoke with him for a number of hours, and then I went down the next year and spoke with him at a much greater length. And I recorded those two conversations. I met him several more times. But what I finally did over the last few years is I went back and listened to the cassette tapes, somewhere not in good shape after this many years, but I was able to retrieve most of the information and put it together in a book, this new book, and I categorized it by topic. God is one chapter, magic is another chapter, astral experiences is another chapter, and so on. And he was a very profound figure, maybe the most interesting person I've met, and I've met a lot of interesting people. And he actually was, to a great extent, the fountainhead of a lot of what I write, because a lot of what I've put together in my books, especially The Waking Dream, stems back directly or indirectly to this man. He had an extraordinarily sophisticated sense of things like magic, astrology, the chakras, and so on, and symbolism. He had this very deep sense of symbolism and the roots of archetypal patterns. And so the book is basically, like I said, in a sense, it's almost an homage to him and his contribution in my life and a lot of other people's lives. And that's kind of a nutshell background on how I met him.
Mm-hmm. What did he call himself? How did he refer to himself? Was he an author? Was he a mystic? What was his self-appointed title?
Funny thing is, he didn't give himself titles. And he studied with Yogananda. He went out to California in the late 30s. He was raised in the Pennsylvania Dutch tradition.
Okay.
And was trained in magic and things like that from a young age down there. But then he went out to California ostensibly to study with an Egyptian mystic by the name of Hamid Bey. And he wasn't around, so Shelly, by default, went to Yogananda and studied with him for a few years. And he could have taken on a Swami name, but chose not to. He did not want to affiliate himself with any organization or any title, per se. And he wanted to stay independent, and he did not want fame. He did not care about money. He was married. He lived a very low-keyed life. He was basically an electronics repairman.
Oh, interesting. I was going to say, how did he survive? Yeah.
Yeah, and he was very independent, born on a Uranus station point exactly, curiously enough. And like I said, did not want to be tied down to organizations or to those sorts. He saw what happened to Yogananda. Mm-hmm. It's not well known, but Yogananda felt very trapped by the responsibilities of his organization. Not that the organization was bad or that he didn't like it. It's just that when you're the head of an organization, or as Shelley put it, when you are in any position of authority, even as a pop star, you become enslaved by all of that. And Yogananda cautioned Shelley, said, you stay free.
You sort of become enslaved by your own image and your own aura. People expect things of you.
Too.
Yeah.
I was thinking, too, just in terms of the sheer responsibilities, Yogananda was basically besieged by followers all the time and by the responsibilities of running a bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. But yes, you point out a much subtler point, which is, you can get trapped by the internal sorts of trappings that come with that sort of fame.
Well, people expect some sort of pearl of wisdom to come out of you at all times, I guess.
Yes.
They expect you to be a fount of infamous knowledge that's going to enlighten them every time you open your mouth. Well, no, you may want to just get us a gallon of milk,
Well, even you and I as astrologers deal with that to a certain
all the time.
degree,
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
It would be very funny if it weren't so difficult at times.
Yeah, it is comical, but it is funny because people stop me in the store and I say, "What is going on in my chart right now?" I say, "Well, I can't just give you a quick answer, So that's, what that's like, yeah." But Shelley is an interesting guy. So he was able to sort of pull together a life as an electronics repairman, as you mentioned. But he spent most of his time as a seeker, perhaps more than anything else, a seeker and a learner. Correct?
Yes, and a teacher, but he taught in a very different way from the other teachers I've spoken with. He taught on a one-to-one basis. You would go to his home and you would spend 4 or 5 hours talking to him. He did give lectures occasionally, especially towards the end of his life in the mid-'80s, but generally he wanted to work with people one-to-one. Mm-hmm. And that was a very unique way of dealing with it because it was tailored to you personally. You could ask questions. And I would go down there with a list of questions, and he would answer the questions. And so that was his modus operandi. And it was very moving because my primary sense of him, I had heard all these stories about him that were pretty extraordinary. People that had visions in his presence and all that sort of, stuff. But when I went down there, the thing that struck me was he was just basically very kind and very patient. And I listened back. It's painful to listen back to these tapes because I'm asking these questions that are almost embarrassing now in terms of how rudimentary they were or how abstract they were. But he was very patient, very kind, and gave very profound answers. He could talk for an hour just to answer a single question. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and doesn't it? And he seems as if he was sort of a humble man in his right. Is that true? He seems to be more.
Yeah,
sort of self-contained and a bit, not ostentatious in any stretch, not sort of playing off this sort of role that he had adopted. More of, people. I'm curious. I think that's probably an accurate description of him, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm wondering if he didn't. How did he become to be known? Was it through word of mouth, for example?
word of mouth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Word of mouth, and he wanted to keep it that way.
Right.
And even though I think that he was probably as enlightened as anyone I've ever met, he was very modest and very humble. And I think, I remember once a teacher, I forget who it was, made a comment that the more enlightened someone becomes, the humbler they become, because they realize how small they are in the greater scheme of things.
Right.
And Shelley was very much that way. There's a comment I make, I think, in the introduction, where a friend of mine went down to talk to Shelley once and said to Shelley, I have a bunch of questions I want to ask you. And Shelley said, fire away. I'm full of useless information. He did not take himself seriously. Mm-hmm. I think he did have, and I have some reason to believe this, I think he did have a very expanded horizon in terms of how he saw things. And you would ask him a question on any number of things, like astrology or quantum physics or, mantras, whatever it is, and he could expound for hours, and yet he was not an academic at all. Mm-hmm. A lot of what I had a very strong impression that a lot of what he knew through direct experience. But he was self-educated. He could talk on things like higher mathematics and quantum physics. But there was you could tell there was a lot of direct experience, and I hope that when people read the book, they'll get some sense of that because of the way he answers the questions. It's not by just quoting sources, for example. There's something direct and immediate about his knowledge, and that's what impressed me most about what he say.
He's interesting. He sounds like a real sort of a vessel of knowledge drawing from a wide array of metaphysical and esoteric sort of arts and studies. Is what it sounds like he is. Sort of like along the lines of what a Manly Hall might have been at the same time. Correct? Do you know?
Yes, I think he probably he went out. Part of the reason he went out to California was in those days, Shelley having been born in 1917, in the 20s and early 30s, Manly Hall was one of the few really good sources. There were several others, like that publishing house in Chicago, I think, DeLawrence, I think. Manly Hall was really kind of the holy grail for a lot of people, and the how do I put this? It was through Manly Hall that a lot of people learned about a lot of other things, such as Kabbalah, Theosophy, astrology, and so on. Mm-hmm. And Shelley went out to California to study at the library, Manly's library. And I'm sure that he met Manly at some point. So I think Manly Hall was a touchstone for him that was very profound at that point of his early studies.
Well, hearing you describe Shelley, he seems as if he's drawing along this, sort of in the same market, for lack of a better word. I mean, they're drawing on the same sort of tools. And it's interesting when you find these people that they have this vast array of knowledge that spans this wide range of different topics and subjects. And they're sort of like, they all seem to arrive at some sort of point of inspiration or value or truth, but they come at it from very different angles. Astrology is different, say, than a psychic or a palm reader or a numerologist. They all have value, but they all come at it. They approach the same topic from a different angle, and I sort of get that impression from looking at the work of Shelly Trimmer that he was much the same kind of a man.
Yes, and I think along that line, I think he was very much of a synthesizer, kind of like
a good way to think it. Yeah,
Hall was very much of a synthesizer. Blavatsky was very much
right, yeah.
And Shelley was, in the sense of, for example, just to use a simple example, or maybe not so simple, he would talk about the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and he would talk about relating that to mathematics and geometry, and he would talk about the chakra system and how you have the 7 chakras up the middle, the 12 compartments on the right and left-hand side, and the 3 channels along the side, which creates a 22. It adds up to 22, and how if you know magic, you know how the different letters can be rearranged to work magic on the chakra system, etc. He would tie together things that you hadn't thought of as being related before.
Right.
And with astrology, with magic, with higher math, and so on.
And did he ever step into the Kabbalah as well? I suppose
he was very much into the Kabbalah. In fact, in some ways, even though he was trained through Yogananda in the yogic system, Kriya Yoga, in some ways he was more of a Kabbalist. And I think before he came to study with Yogananda, he was very much into the Golden Dawn and very much into MacGregor Mathers and possibly Crowley, I'm not sure, and the Kabbalistic terminology. Like, he didn't talk about the planes of existence the way the Blavatsky or the yogis did. He talked about the four worlds of Asia, Yetzirah, and so on. So very, very heavily into the Kabbalistic system and the Tree of Life and Kabbalistic magic, as well as yogic magic and all this.
It's interesting. So he was a contemporary. I mean, he's when you mentioned Blavatsky and people like that, these people seem to all have come at a very unique time, which I think is kind of interesting, especially when you look back to the rise of the Theosophists and stuff, and the work of Carl Jung, especially, who brought a lot of validity to it from the sort of the professional psychological aspect. Brought a lot of credence to it and opened up a lot of doors in that regard. But they seem to have had this very unusual Piscean kind of influence, or sort of Neptunian influence is what I meant. More along those lines. I thought of that because Neptune's in Pisces currently. But they seem as if there's a direct link between that and the exploration of this type of information. Do you happen to see that at all?
I'm not sure what you mean by the Neptunian. I know what Neptune means, of course. I'm not sure how you're applying that to these individuals.
Yeah, more the idea of, sort of dealing with this, back in, when Neptune was last in Pisces was around 1848, in that era, leading up into that time frame, where these types of topics became much more part of the mainstream and were more accepted as, say, than they had been in the past.
Yeah, and I also tie this back. This is a little tangential, but I think it's interesting. We had that extraordinary Pluto-Neptune conjunction in the 1890s, which happens every 500 years, and that really kind of opened up the floodgates. And it's significant that I think it was Secret Doctrine came out, I believe, in 1888. And then you had Swami Vivekananda and the Parliament of World Religions in 1893, and it was almost as though that opened up this portal into mysteries, and all this information flooded out, of which Manly Hall and Yogananda and Shelly Trimmer and Carl Jung. Carl Jung, though he was born in 1875, same year as Crowley, interestingly, I believe that's right. They really rode the wave, just like the composers like Debussy did. They rode the wave of that Pluto-Neptune.
Right, and I think all the art and the products that came out of that era is very indicative of that conjunction. It really has a really strong departure, a powerful sort of dreamlike quality. When you listen to Debussy and Ravel, all those composers of that time, there's really that strong component there, right? Very powerful.
And the artwork of the 1890s. I was just saying this to someone this morning about the art that came out in the 1890s was unbelievable at times, like Jean Dalville's Satan's Treasures, or some of the not the pre-Raphaelites, but some of the mystical kind of pre-surrealist artists that came around in the 1890s. It was a game changer what happened in the 1890s, and that extended easily into the aughts and the teens, 1920s, and all that. And they're surrealists, and Carl Jung and Freud, all of these different figures were profound catalysts in culture.
Yeah, it's interesting that Shelly, his work has the same sort of thing we've been talking about. There's this broad range of a collection of knowledge, and did you get the impression from talking to him that he was able to sort of homogenize all this into some sort of logical approach to life? I mean, he wasn't picking and choosing any one particular modality. He was sort of more.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so he's
I
more.
mean, for him, it wasn't about any one system. So he might talk in one conversation about the tarot and how a certain card of the tarot deck related to a certain letter of the Hebrew alphabet, how that related to a certain planet, how that related to some magical ritual or something. It was a kind of a mind blower for me at that young age to sit there and listen to all this. And part of the reason it took me so many years to write the book was it took me a long time to digest what he said. In particular, his comments about God, and which were very interesting. And putting it all together, he did have this holistic mindset, a synthetic, integral sort of way of looking at all these things.
I think the title of the book speaks to it probably better than anything. An infinity of gods, as if there is an infinite number of gods and an infinite number of ways to approach getting to God itself, or to find that concept of God, maybe the small g God. These are all sort of this. There's an endless path to this sort of awakening, or the sense of comfort that you might get from arriving at this place.
Well, the way I'll say a little bit about this, and it was maybe the thing that had the biggest impact on me at the time, was when he did talk about God. I had been raised I was raised a Lutheran, but then when I got into kind of more mystical directions, I more or less went along with the standard mythology of we were all created by God and God created the universe and all that. And Shelley had a somewhat different view that might be called Gnostic, a benign Gnosticism, as well as in the Indic school of Samkhya philosophy. There's a notion that Shelley would say we're not created by God, we're more or less co-creators with God, that God is another being like we are, that each of us is a God, and there are infinite number of gods. I'm distilling a complex doctrine, by the way, needless to say. But this idea that we entered into God's dream, and that we're learning the lessons of that dream, and that we can leave if we want to, although that's quite a trick. But we were not created by God. We are self-existent ones, is the term that Shelley used.
Interesting. So did he regard humans as the inventors of God?
No, God, and this gets very tricky because the language is hard, of course.
Right, I understand.
No, that God has an independent existence, just as you and I have an independent existence, and that we are gods, like God, but God is more evolved. Like in the Kabbalists, they sometimes talk about the Ancient One as a term, that he's been at this a lot longer than we have, but we all existed, and one of us became enlightened, so to speak, and created this dream, and we entered into this dream. And I do hope people will read the book to get the nuances that I can't possibly include here, because it's quite complex, but it's quite a game changer the way he presents it. And yet if you go to India, for instance, it's not that alien in the Indic schools of philosophy, because the Vedantic school basically says, it's all just one being wearing all these different masks, okay? Whereas in the Samkhya school, which is sometimes, I think, maybe simplistically talked about as being, there's Prakriti and Purusha, matter and spirit. But there's another aspect of the Samkhya school, which is that there are indeed individual divine beings. We are individuals. We aren't just, all, masks on this one, overarching being. And it sounds dualistic. It's not quite as dualistic as it sounds, in the same way that the pieces of a holograph, when you break them apart, are they really separate? Are they not? No, they're not really separate. They're all intertwined, and yet they have a distinct uniqueness of their own.
Which when taken together, create a composite, which then becomes the holograph.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
that's true for everything. I think all beings are a composite of a number of different things, I think.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of a non-dual dualism is the way I refer to what Shelley talked about and what they say in the Samkhya school. Well,
when you mentioned duality, that's interesting. I've been talking about a lot of that lately, sort of this duality of world, of where we are and how we are dualistic individuals in our right, I believe. And I know that he has a chapter, you have a chapter in the book, rather, on the binary self, which sort of caught my eye because I've been talking about this a lot recently on my shows and stuff. And it's that quality that I think within that duality it seems to be an inherent part of all of the basic structure of life. And that is a very much, sort of maybe was not realized at the time that he wrote this or you discussed this with him, perhaps it was, But the binary world is really what we are now living in some capacity. We sort of have evolved into that in more ways than one. Very much in the very concrete way, our digital world that we live in, the digital technology even, is all about that.
You know, the way he talked about it, I can't think of the name of the scientist who had this notion, the participatory universe, where you have a large U. He symbolized it with a large U letter, symbolizing U for universe, and how you had an eyeball at the top of one of those two arches, and one is looking at the other. It's the same thing looking at itself. You hold out your hand, for example, and you look at your hand, and it's the same being. It's you looking at yourself. And that Shelley had a very interesting and very mysterious comment when he said that the self is a one that forever functions as a two. Huh. The self is forever observing itself. Forever.
Right, and that is the great conundrum, because when we start looking at ourselves, we get into this terrible wind, sort of this spiral of it's like looking into a hall of mirrors almost.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And he related this to the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake that's eating its own tail, which is usually taken, and I think misinterpreted as simply meaning infinity. But Shelley's interpretation, which I think is much subtler, is this idea of the self. Well, this is another phrase of Shelley's. The self must forever eat of the self to sustain the self. Mm. You are forever observing your own nature. You look out at the world, you think there's a world outside of you. You're looking at yourself. And that enlightenment, that somatic sort of awakening, has to do with realizing there's nothing but you, that you are seeing yourself in all these mirrors around yourself.
Wow, that's a really heavy concept, but it's very complex. I mean, you can see how it just goes on and on and on in a perpetual sort of self-feeding and self-perpetuating kind of loop. It's a continual conversation that just goes on and on. And I was thinking of the term of binary self, or the binary or the dualistic world, as sort of this. We are on this helios that goes around and around, and we come back to where we were before, but we're always in a different place in time. That's sort of the basis of astrology, as you well know. Right. And we have that same quality there of sort of being on a perpetual pendulum that swings from one extreme and back across to the other. And in between we have these periods of relative lull and calm, but then we get to the other end of the spectrum where things become one or the other, which is sort of what's the great complex of life. Yeah, interesting. We're talking today with Ray Grasse. He is a author, an astrologer, a musician, and a photographer, and he's just released a new book, or it's about to be released, called An Infinity of Gods. It's his conversations of the teachings of Shelly Trimmer. And when we get back after a break, we're going to take a little more look at the book and some of the actual chapters of what he's written and what he's observed, and sort of what we can peel away from that as a sort of a greater lesson. This topic and this man, Shelly Trimmer, is a very complex man with a multifaceted kind of approach to life, all of which I think makes sense to me, and I'm sure it makes sense to you, Ray, after all these years. But it does take some processing. It does take some time to sort of homogenize all this, or homologate this into a lifestyle, and I think that's an interesting concept. But we'll get into that when we get back. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Ray Grasse. His website is raygrasse, GRASSE.com, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Ray? Yes,
that's right.
Yeah. And take a quick run over there while we're on break, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes, so hang in there. What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color.
Okay, we're back. We're talking today with Ray Grasse. He is an author, an astrologer, a musician, and a photographer, and he wears all those hats quite well, I would argue. His website is raygrasse, GRASSE.com. I've had him on my show several times to discuss his other books, which are well worth looking into, all of which are available on Amazon, including his new book, An Infinity of Gods, The Teachings of Shelly Trimmer. It's available at Amazon. It's by Ray Grasse, GRASSE. Fascinating subject because he really is an all-inclusive sort of accept everything kind of teacher, it seems like to me, Ray, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as if there's really nothing that he didn't touch on. I mean, obviously, when you look at the chapters of your book, they go into all of these different modalities, but you could argue, well, what's missing is Christianity and stuff like that. But I'm sure that he probably has a comment on that and an approach on that. But when you look at the wide range of topics that he dipped into, did you ever get the impression that he was more inclined towards one or the other, or was one that is more of his default mechanism he could defer to, or he just sort of always approached everything with this huge array of ideas?
Interesting question. I think that's really interesting because I could narrow it down to maybe 5.
Right. Okay.
I couldn't say one is more important than the other, but astrology was one, magic was another, high magic. Mm-hmm. God and enlightenment and the search for God and the techniques that get you to God was another one. Mathematics, he was fascinated by it. I don't want to say numerology because that's got a lot of bad hype in it, but he was interested in numbers and math. And
well, I think mathematics is at the core of almost everything that we talk about. I've lately come to the conclusion, or at least come to the opinion, that mathematics is at the basic underlying core of all things, and it is, in some form or another, it enters into all things, and it's almost as if mathematics can pretty much explain almost everything. Now, I know that's quite a bold statement, and it's pretty far out there, but it seems as if that's the case.
Yes.
When you talk about magic, I'm interested in the concept of magic because I know that it's got a sort of a certain amount of baggage attached to it, and I don't want that to be misinterpreted. And I think that through the eyes of Shelly Trimmer, magic took on a much different look than it does in popular culture. Correct?
Yeah, and for my own sake, I've made a distinction that I actually derived from Shelly indirectly, which is there's a difference between inner magic and outer magic. Mm-hmm. In the sense that when you do a certain set of mantras or to create a certain state of mind, or you work with inner visualizations like in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, that's working on, you're trying to transform or in some sense amplify inner states of awareness. Then there's outer magic, which is where you're trying, whether it's working with sigils or elaborate rituals that try to change things in the outer world. it's not a question for me of good and bad. One is good, the other is bad. It's a question of they're very different.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And the outer magic is very tricky because you set things, like I said to a friend, or I say it in the book too, how I've seen people set things into motion they didn't anticipate.
Aha.
And, the law of unintended consequences. And Shelley, when he started out very young, was very conversant and quite skilled at outer magic, and I show some examples of that in the book. And I think that as he got older and learned his lesson the hard way with that by seeing what problems that can cause, I think my sense was very strongly that he withdrew a lot of that and became more interested in the more internalized, what they might call theurgical type of magic, working with spiritual energies. Mm-hmm. And he became very adamant, to whatever degree he was adamant, because he was always kind of laid back about these things, about the fact of non-interference. In the Star Trek you have that idea about the Prime Directive,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You don't interfere with alien civilizations. It's like that movie, Gods Must Be Crazy. You drop a bottle onto the plane, and next thing you know, the civilization is in chaos. And likewise, it's the same sort of thing with other people's lives. You change things in the world, and you set things into motion. And it's very important not to interfere. And that was his spiritual ethic. Like when Yogananda tried to get Shelley to come back to the Self-Realization Center out in California with his brother and sister. And Shelley said, no, I don't feel right about that because it would be subjecting them to Yogananda's restrictions and his teachings and his techniques. And you need to go to a teacher or to a system of your own volition. You shouldn't evangelize. You shouldn't try to change people. He was very, very, firm about that. What was the question?
No, you're on the right track here. It's more about the question I asked was, did he lean towards one modality over the other? And then you said he had about 5. And I think that the idea, you raise an interesting point, this idea of interference, because we can influence people. And as an astrologer who does readings, as you and I both do, we know that you can plant a seed in someone that could go awry if not couched correctly. If not handled delicately with the right amount of sensitivity to the individual and to the person. And I think that sort of is an interesting approach because it allows you, or he, in his case, to tap into all of this realm of knowledge and sort of bring it to you and say, here it is, do with it what you will, without any sense of bias or sort of predetermined judgment of which way to go, correct?
This reminds me of when I first got into astrology. I had no qualms about saying to someone if I met them or at a party or something like that, and I would ask them their birth date, and then I would proceed to launch into making comments about their chart and the aspects they had coming up. And I learned the hard way that was not wise, that now if someone asks me a question, I will give them my advice to the best of my ability, but I let them come to me.
Right.
I don't evangelize. Mm-hmm. I don't, because, I've set things in motion where you give someone an advice, someone comes to you and they tell you that they're a Sag and, you've got Saturn in your sign and you better not do this or that. It's that kind of nonsensical, amateurish approach to astrology. And I've learned through, some hard knocks not to try to change people or to, give them advice that they haven't asked for.
Right. I think it's more a question of trying to present information in ways that allow them to come up with their own conclusion. You say, this is what we see. This is not good nor bad. This is what we see, and this is how we go. It's interesting. I'm looking at the table of contents, and it's a fascinating. I can't say I've read the book all the way through, but I have dipped in and out of it, which is what I tend to do with books anyway. But I'm fascinated by the breadth of topics. He's got everything here from self-observation, creative breakthroughs, 3 books on a desert island, spiritual evolution, self-acceptance by location, powerful link from the past. I mean, karma, astrology, love of animals. It's just dealing with stress and anxiety. It just goes on and on and on. And when you see these chapters, like just pulling out, for example, a powerful link from the past. I mean, that must be a chapter that deals perhaps with karma and how we may be reincarnated and we are on a trail of, sort of a continuous cycle of birth and death and rebirth. Is that accurate to say that he had that approach?
Yeah, indirectly and directly. And that chapter is a very short one that recounts an anecdote this Goswami Kriyananda told about the first time he met Shelly, which is one of my favorite stories, where Kriyananda he was Chicago-born, his name was Melvin Higgins, and he wanted to get into yoga. And he heard about Shelly through the grapevine when he was living up in Minnesota in the backwoods with his wife and kids. And so he went up to meet Shelly. He managed to arrange a meeting at Shelly's home in Minnesota. And went up there, and he was met at the door by Shelly's wife, Marjorie, at the time. And she said, Shelly's meditating at the moment. You come on in and have a seat until Shelly comes in. So they sat there talking for a few minutes. Then Shelly appears at the door, marches up to Kriyananda, Melvin at the time, military style, clicks his heels and salutes Kriyananda, and then sits down. And that was Kriyananda's first experience with Shelly, and that gives you some sense of his tricksterous side. And then he didn't know what to make of it. He thought maybe this guy was a crazy man, and he thought maybe I made a mistake coming all this way. But they sat down to eat lunch. And he said that as Kriyananda's bottom end hit the chair, he had this vision from a past life. He said that he was sitting there in the room with Shelly, and this cloud appeared around the room, almost like in the movies, and he suddenly had this sense of what he called a powerful link from the past. The implication, he did not say what it was, but it was clearly, to my mind, some militaristic past life. That involved Shelly and maybe, his involvement. Kriyananda had the chart of a general, sun in Taurus led by 4 planets in Aries. And so I do think it was a militaristic background. And he said in that moment he understood his connection to Shelly and to a certain extent what his destiny in this life was.
Interesting. Wow.
So that's an answer to your question in a way.
Yeah, no, I understand that because, he would have had to embrace this and much of this is derived from Eastern philosophy. This is fairly new at the time that he was talking about this in Western world, right? This is very much, and it was Jung rather, who took his travels into the East that he had discovered a lot of this and brought it back and just started to do research that gave it a sense of credence and authenticity that was lacking in other areas. And then, of course, someone like Shelly comes along with all these great ideas, sort of presents them in a way that allows us to really, it shifts our perception of how life and the logic of life really is, which I find to be one of the most fascinating pieces of astrology, as well as all of these esoteric sciences. They really do help to explain that which cannot be explained in some capacity. And actually, it does it quite effectively, I think, with regard to how convincing this is and how genuine and how real it is. But it does, like you say, it does take some digestion.
Well, the other thing here that I think is important is that as critical as information and knowledge was to Shelly and what he imparted, he kept coming back to this notion of how meditation was really where it was at. Mm-hmm. And that not only was that the path to enlightenment, but it also was the path to deeper knowledge. That there's a chapter in the book, I think it's 3 Books to a Desert Island, right, that talks about this notion of, well, in yoga they call it samayama, I think, which is about you focus, you do samadhi on a given topic or object, and you come up with information about it. So that meditation also becomes a way to tap into knowledge that can't be accessed any other way.
Knowledge that may be inherent in you, do you think? Or knowledge that is there, but the only way to get to it is to sort of get into this state?
It's inherent in you to the degree that you are everything.
Right, exactly. Therefore, we all have the propensity to do this, correct?
Well, you do. Like I remember a friend of mine that taught high school, And at one time, he's now retired, but he made a comment how one day he just felt like he was in the zone, and students were asking him questions about things he had no previous knowledge of, such as like how many tonnage of bombs were dropped in World War II, and he would come up with the figure, and then he would look it up later, and it was accurate.
Wow.
It's you hear these stories of people that can tap into things. Edgar Cayce is a classic example.
Exactly, yeah.
How is it they can do it unless you have access to the collective unconscious, unless to some extent you are the entire world?
Right, which would indicate that there is and I think meditation gets everybody closer to this because it is a way of tuning your antenna to receive these types of things. And I think the more that you delve into this realm and are part of this realm, the more those types of events happen. I call them synchronistic events. We've had this conversation in the past about synchronicity. I'm sure that he found logic into synchronicity as a holdover or as a projection of the inner mind manifesting outside without our own knowledge of it, without us being able to acknowledge it, or at least be able to orchestrate it. We can't really orchestrate synchronicity. We can sort of say, well, I'm going to meditate today, I'm going to think about it, but then when these events happen, these synchronistic events happen, we're blown away by it because we're like, wow, how did that happen? Until you stop and put together and say, maybe this is really supposed to happen. It really is fascinating.
He never actually used the word synchronicity, and yet that was essentially his worldview. When you talked to him and you realized he did feel everything was interconnected, everything was interlocking, and astrology, I think we've talked about this before, to my mind, astrology is the art and science of synchronicity, because it really talks about how everything, this theory of correspondences, everything in your life is connected. Shelley would talk, though, about how the outer reflects the inner, and as above, so below. That is an integral part, I think, of that esoteric worldview. So whether someone knows the term synchronicity or not, I think that that's implicit.
The word may not have been invented when he was around. I mean, I think it was Jung who came up with the word, although it may not have been widely known at the time. But
I think 1951, 52, I think, is when it actually was published by Jung.
Yeah. So that was fairly late. So he maybe didn't have a chance to understand it or whatever. But essentially, all of the things that are in his list of knowledge sort of do point to that, because we do. And I think the thing is that he's trying to impart that we have a control over our destiny to the extent that within the limits perhaps of our astrology chart or our natal birth order or our placement when we came to this planet. We do have sort of a predestiny to it. There's a certain amount of predestiny there, I think, and that and when you acknowledge it and accept it and regard it and view it, you can therefore then move forward with that knowledge to perhaps make your life more complete.
Yeah, he did feel, unlike Yogananda, felt that there was value in astrology, but it wasn't a major factor for him, whereas it was for Shelley. Shelley did feel that it was very important to understand those patterns of destiny. He always did say you could overcome, almost any difficult patterns, any karmas, to within reason. But he felt that understanding the horoscope gave you a roadmap. It was a way of kind of navigating through life in terms of where to go, where not to go, that sort of thing.
And it does so in broad themes. You're not going to get perhaps the specificity that many people in popular culture look for or strive to find or are thirsty for, but you get within the ballpark, which I think is pretty damn good considering how unusual life can be at times and how unpredictable all of our things are. When you look back at this time with him, I'm sure that this experience that you had in compiling this information and getting it published and all that has brought up a lot of interesting thoughts for you in particular, because you're being so intimate with this information. And I'm wondering if it has caused you in some ways to rethink certain aspects of life or the human condition.
Only in every possible way.
That's what I was afraid you were going to say. Yeah, I can imagine.
I can be a little more specific than that. Like, for example, my first book, The Waking Dream, which took 15 years to write or so, I was more or less using the springboard of his kind of integral approach to bring together a lot of different ideas. And in the waking dream, I more or less cap it off, I think, in chapter 11 with a lot of the sacred geometry notions, the architecture of the self, and all this sort of thing. I mean, I owe a lot of what I do with synthesizing back to what Shelley did. So it had a very profound impact on me on a number of levels.
Yeah, and he's a fascinating guy from just the sheer breadth of topics that he has, and I'm curious about some topics. I know that you have one specific chapters that are perhaps resonate more with you, and I'm happy to touch on those. But I'm also curious about sort of the idea of the nature of time is an interesting one for me, simply because that is a very difficult construct for us to get our heads around. We know it exists. We know that we are marked by it. We sort of measure it. We walk through our lives with this clock ticking, and yet we really don't know how it all happens. The second that just passed the second that just went by the clock on this as we're speaking contains within it all of history to date. And yet it's just that one little second, and that we can't go back to that second. The river only flows one direction, and these concepts seem to be part and parcel of all of what he's talking about.
I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'll try to put this simply. My line of questioning to Shelley about time stemmed from a psychedelic experience I had when I was 19. Mm-hmm. That was not a very pleasant trip, but it was so intense that it has some breakthroughs associated. And one of them was I kind of peered into the moment and saw that each moment consisted of thousands, if not millions, of finer thought moments, like a film strip, and how you look at it. And I asked Shelley about this. I didn't tell him about my experience. I wanted to see if he came up with it on his own. And he said something very similar. He talked about how time is comprised of these individual thought moments, similar to, let's say, the 24 frames of a movie film, and that if you go into samadhi, if you move into the central channel, sushumna, the pathway of kundalini, if you move into that balanced channel, time stands still. It's only when you move out of balance, when you move out of samadhi, that time starts up again, what he calls you start running on God's time. You're in God's memory tract. It's kind of like going into a library and leafing through a book. Mm-hmm. You're giving the time to those pages. You're giving the sequencing. And so that time, it's a subjective phenomena. We're all on the same time track, so to speak. But one of the examples he used is if you're sitting in meditation, and you go into samadhi, and there's a young girl jumping rope in front of you, you'll see her stop in midair, freeze frame. And then when you come out of samadhi, she'll start moving again. That's a lower level samadhi where there's still form. I'm simplifying a lot.
I understand. Yeah, I understand that. But his approach was the way to tap into all. Would you think that his entryway into all of these esoteric arts is through meditation? Is that impression you got from him?
Yes, but he didn't discount the importance of just using your brain in terms of study. Like a friend of mine went down there and said to Shelley how he was going to get a PhD in Sanskrit studies, and Shelley was all for it. He said, that's a really good discipline. You'll learn a lot from it. So he didn't discount formal academic or intellectual avenues. He felt that they had to be supported, though, by that deeper awakening. That's the infrastructure to the intellectual studies.
Right, those are the nuts and bolts that are good to learn, but you've got to have a willingness to go there to begin with.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. Fascinating guy. We're talking today with Ray Grasse. His book is coming out. It is available at Amazon. It's called An Infinity of Gods, The Teachings of Shelly Trimmer, who was a esoteric teacher, mystic. I mean, what kind of title would you give him? What is the title you give him?
Well, I'd say the simplest one would be spiritual teacher, but you could also say metaphysician, occultist. Yeah. Scientist, amateur scientist. He's an interesting fellow, kind of an Einstein on steroids.
Yeah, exactly. Highly intellectual and do you think, did he ever think that this information that he was a channel for this information, or did he ever see himself as a vessel of sort of the information coming through him?
Yes, but he didn't take any of it seriously, and that was an interesting thing. When I was very young, and I first went to him, and I was talking about, I was clearly impatient with getting my own writing out there, and he said, "What's the hurry?" I said, "Well, I feel I've got something to offer." He says, his basic attitude was, I don't care what, whether people read what I say and people know about it, because if I don't say it, someone else will. He had this very detached attitude about the importance of his own work. And I asked him once, I said, how come you've never written any books? And he says, my students are my books. But there was this total contentment about where he was at, and that if people wanted to draw from him the information, he was all for it, and he was very generous with his teaching, but he did not take what he did seriously, which I thought was a sign of great wisdom.
Interesting, yeah. That does somehow make sense to me. I can almost see that. He sort of just lived with it as as a knowledge pool that he had, not database, of knowledge base or whatever, of information that he had that he was not particularly attached to. That's what made me think of him more as a messenger, perhaps. But obviously he lived his life with these, underneath these with this language, and uses it on a daily basis. So
yeah.
Yeah, fascinating, interesting guy. And how lucky were you to have the experience of spending time with him? I mean, this is like being, going to the altar or something and being blessed. It's just, phenomenal experience to be able to have this wealth of information and to be able to learn and to share it in this way. I think is great.
Well, I do feel lucky, and I know some people that spent much more time with him than I did, but still. It was a great opportunity, and I felt like I had to give it back out to the world. That's why I put this book together, in large part just because I wanted to share what I learned, and people may or may not get anything out of it, but it's out there if they want to try.
Yeah, no. And as I said, I'm sure it must have reinforced your own opinions and sense of logic and order and structure as to how things work. It must have been I anticipate that happening to me as I work my way through it in a deeper capacity. I'm sure that these will all make sense to me. Just by looking at the table of contents and dipping in and out of it, I have begun to feel that this all makes perfect sense to me. And I'm not sure that that's just because I do work with astrology, or if that's because it's basic elemental information for any human, I guess is what I would say.
I think that, because you are in an esoteric field, I think that holistic synthetic approach is kind of intrinsic to that perspective.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And tying things together, I think that kind of comes to the territory of what you and I do.
Right, exactly. And when he would talk about astrology, how would he frame it? Was he able to read charts? Was he able to talk, converse?
Oh,
yeah.
He had several levels. On a very practical level, he was a brilliant practical astrologer, and he had a lot of traditional ideas and notions, but he was familiar with, let's say, both sidereal. He had tried both Vedic and Western styles. He looked at the nodes. I mean, he was very comprehensive with his astrology, but then he got into the deeper side of it, which is the esoteric side, which I didn't go into the book too much. I touch on it in the chapter, The Three Channels, but he went into tying it back to sacred geometry in a way that I've never seen done before, and the chakras, and how the horoscope reflects the inner chakras, and you look at a horoscope and the planets and the signs relate to the different energies and the chakras within. So there was a whole esoteric spiritual side of it that was quite unique.
Yeah, well, there's so much wisdom and so much, for lack of a better word, meat in this book, because it's just so rich with ideas, and it's compressed and in a way that's very accessible, I think, which is what's going to make it an easy read for other people to pick up on. I think that those of you who go out and get this book and read it, you will be surprised at how much you will get from it. I think at the end of it, when you go through this whole array of these different topics that range from imagination to psychic investigations to magic to illusion, reality, propaganda, palmistry, future science, all of these things, and the list is long. There's 37 chapters in this book. I think people will come away with almost like what do I want the word? An encyclopedic kind of knowledge of how things work. For lack of a better way of saying it.
I hope so.
Yeah, I really do. I mean, it seems that way. But he must have had also, in summary, he must have had a wonderful sense of self and I don't mean that to be boastful. I mean, the humility word is what comes back to me. He must have had was he self-effacing? Was he sort of, was he sort of, he was not full of himself, obviously, because you can see that.
I think he was confident in his abilities and his knowledge, but not in an egotistical way.
Right.
And again, the humility was very evident, and the compassion was very evident as well. He was a deeply compassionate individual, which is maybe the most impressive thing about him.
Did he have a sense of humor?
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, he laughed throughout much of our conversations. Again, he did not take himself that seriously, and if you met him on the street and talked to him, you really wouldn't think there was anything that unusual about him. He knew how to mingle. He knew how to just be an ordinary person, and yet when you got into deep conversation with him, you realized this was not an ordinary person.
Interesting. Wow. What a great way to just summarize him as an individual. We've been talking today with Ray Grasse. His new book is called An Infinity of Gods, which I think is a fabulous title because it just it fills that blank for me that I've always been searching for, the idea that God is everywhere, and I'm speaking of God with a small g, and that there's an array of opportunities and ways of exploring out there that can be homogenized into a single sort of thought process. I think it's wonderful. Again, the title of the book is called An Infinity of Gods, The Teachings of Shelly Trimmer. And it's a collection of interviews that the author, Ray Grasse, my guest, had the good fortune of meeting and discussing and recording with this wonderful, fascinating gentleman, Shelly Trimmer, back when he was younger. And it is now available. It's on Amazon.
Yeah.
An Infinity of Gods by Ray Grasse. Ray's last name is Grasse. I encourage you to look into it. And Ray, thanks so much for talking to me. You've really piqued my curiosity, and I can't wait to delve into this further.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'd love to continue talking about this. I think we just sort of grazed the top of this subject. There's so much richness in here, and I can just see this conversation going on. So maybe we'll come back and discuss this again in the future if you're willing.
Sounds good to me.
All right. That's great, Ray. Thanks so much for coming on today. I appreciate it again. Ray Grasse, Grasse.com. RayGrasse.com is his website. And Infinity of Gods is the name of the book. And it's The Teachings of Shelly Trimmer, a fascinating esoteric, I would call him an esoteric genius of sorts. So, all right, Ray. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on today. Take good care.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.